Thank you very much. Morning everyone. Dan's teed me up really nicely. I want to talk a little bit about our work in Manchester and Preston specifically. So I work for the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. We're a think tank and research organisation based in Manchester, but we do work across the UK, across Europe and indeed internationally. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey that I've been on personally over the course of the last 12 years around procurement and social value. And I remember a very early conversation I had with colleagues back in 2006. And my question to them was like, should we do some research work around procurement and how it links to local economic development? And they said, no, it's really boring, it's really dull, it's really bureaucratic, and it's really technical. And I said, no, it's really exciting actually, and it's exciting for three reasons in my mind. One is the scale of procurement spend. So if we went back to 2006, central government was spending about £280 billion a year buying stuff, buying goods and services. Our local authorities were spending about £70 billion buying goods and services. So it's a huge amount of public money. If you look across Europe, public procurement actually accounts for about 14% of GDP. So we spend a significant amount of money buying goods and services. The second reason I said it was interesting because we were just coming to the end of that kind of funny money stage in 2006. We'd had lots of investment in regeneration programs, neighbourhood renewal funding, single regeneration budget, New Deal for communities. All that money suddenly kind of disappeared. And I kind of started thinking, well, how can we deliver some of those outcomes without some of that area-based initiative? And procurement felt to me was a real lever, a way in which public authorities and other organisations could use their spend more effectively. And the third reason I felt it was exciting is because it's our money. We're all taxpayers. We all contribute towards how procurement spend is undertaken. And we have a right for that spend to be undertaken in an efficient but also really effective manner. And that's where kind of social value links in for me. So we started a programme of work and we went and visited the head of corporate procurement at Manchester City Council back in about 2007, 2008. And Ian asked me three very pertinent but quite worrying questions during that meeting. The first question was, where does our money go? So they had a spend of £900 million. Where does that money go geographically? What sectors are we spending money with? And what types of organisations are we spending money with? So how are we spending with the voluntary and community sector, social enterprise, SMEs and large corporate organisations? So they had a £900 million spend, but they didn't really know where that money went in terms of those kind of three kind of key areas of consideration. The second question he asked related to the behaviour of the procurement officers. So procurement officers within the City of Manchester and anywhere else were trained in particular ways, and rightly so. They were trained to think about compliance with legislation, they were trained to think about price, and they were trained to think a little bit about quality. And Ian said to me, well, how can we get them to think about other factors facing the city? Look out that window out the town hall, you see the fourth most deprived local authority area in England out of 324. How can we use procurement as a way of addressing some of those challenges that those people face? And the third thing is that we often forget there's kind of two parties in any procurement process. There's a procurement officer and there's a supply chain. How can we get the supply chain to change their behaviour? How can we influence them so they deliver more for local economies, in social terms and environmental terms? So we went away and we started thinking about those three questions. And it's kind of stimulated a 10-year programme of work for the organisation. Our starting point, as always, was evidence. So trying to understand where that £900 million of money went. And we looked at various different tiers of evidence. We looked at geography, which is important in terms of trying to understand where money goes within Greater Manchester, Manchester, the wider Northwest, and also in terms of kind of specific wards and areas of deprivation within Manchester itself. We were also interested in sectors, so how much money was spent in the construction sector, how much money was spent wholesale, how much money was spent in ICT. So we were trying to develop that evidence base. And the third tier of spend analysis was trying to understand how much was spent specifically with small to medium-sized enterprises. And that's our baseline picture. So in 2008, 2009, about 51.5% of spend was with organisations that were based in Manchester or with a branch within the Manchester City Council boundary. Interestingly, we also started to think about what started to happen to that money once it reached the supply chain. what affinity, what value did they place upon being based in Manchester in terms of their own recruitment practices, their own kind of supply chain choices. So we did some survey work, and we found that suppliers re-spent 25 pence in every pound that they received through procurement back in that Manchester economy. I just want you to keep those figures in mind for the time being. So the work that we've undertaken, all this has been undertaken in coordination, in collaboration with the City Council, has been around 3 themes. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this has all been about cultural shift. This has been about shifting the behaviour of a local authority procurement team to be more integrated within their local authority, but also to kind of really change the way in which procurement brings an impact, not just for the economy of a place, but also in wider social value terms. So we've done 3 strands of activity. Just in terms of that process of procurement, one of the simplest things we did right at the outset was that we put at the front of every invitation to tender document the City Council's corporate priorities. So those corporate priorities were reducing unemployment, raising aspiration in the population, and increasing private sector growth in the city. By putting those at the front of every invitation to tender, it automatically got the supply chain thinking, they don't just want a good or service here, they don't just want a price for that, they actually want us to contribute to this. So it was kind of an organic, voluntary way of kind of starting to stimulate social value thinking within the supply chain. That's since been formalised. So in about 2011 and before the Social Value Act, Manchester City started to include a 10% weighting on social value in their procurement. So as well as more traditional considerations around cost and quality, 10% was weighted around social value. That's since increased. So in 2015, that was increased to 20%. So social value took on a lot more kind of added importance in the procurement process. And it wasn't just about kind of local businesses winning those contracts. It was about businesses regardless of whether they were based in Middlesbrough, Manchester, Maidenhead, Motherwell, and any other places beginning with M, bringing social value through what they delivered. Not just for Manchester, but also for their own communities in terms of creating jobs, developing skills, and developing the capacity of the supply chain. The second thing, which has been quite interesting, has been engagement with suppliers. Often, and when we started this work, 3-year contract issued to a supply chain, off you go and deliver that good or service. We'll come back in 3 years' time and we'll recommission you to do it. I think that doesn't make sense when we start talking about social value, and I think we need continuous engagement with the supply chain. And we started doing work specifically with suppliers that are based in areas of deprivation within the city. So as part of that supply chain analysis in 2008-2009, we found that £87 million was spent with suppliers based in the 10% most deprived neighbourhoods nationally in Manchester. So what did we do? With the procurement team and with the contract management team, we went and visited them and said, look, supplier, you've got a £5 million contract with us. This was prior to the Social Value Act. There's a neighbourhood over there. 70% of the people are out of work. 50% have no skills. What are you going to do about it through the delivery of this contract? So there was a kind of an organic influence of those organisations based in areas of deprivation. And the final thing was around enhancing impact. We started to kind of collect data, and this links into what Peter will talk about this afternoon in terms of the Greater Manchester Social Value Procurement Framework. But we started to collect data around how many jobs supply chain organisations were creating, how many apprenticeships they were creating and sustaining, what they were doing with the voluntary and community sector through CSR type activities, but also other types of activities, how many hours of volunteering support they were providing, how much carbon emissions they were undertaking. So we started to gather a much more intelligent understanding in an output basis, which is an important consideration of where spend was going. So the impact of that, I always say during these presentations that local spend is one barometer of success in this piece of work. Far more important is the social value that's been generated through the process of procurement, and far more important is the cultural shift that's happened within a local authority. Procurement officers are no longer working in silos. They're working with economic development people. They're working with commissioners. They're no longer just thinking about cost and compliance. They're also thinking about social value. But some of the kind of key facts and data is that 51.5% is now around about 71%. So there's been an increase in spend in the Manchester economy, not just as a result of this work, but also as a result of an approach to economic development, which is about attracting new businesses and stimulating new businesses and developing the capacity of businesses to bid for opportunities. So there's been an increase in local spend. One of the key things for me has been that local spend has been twinned with increased spend with small to medium-sized enterprises. If you think that central government has a target for 33% of direct and indirect spend to be with SMEs, the 59% that Manchester now spends with small to medium-sized enterprises is quite significant. It's ahead of central government and a lot of other local authorities when it comes to spending with small businesses, which obviously has kind of knock-on consequences for the economy and also knock-on consequences in terms of social value. I'm not going to go through all these figures, but this is some of the data that we collect. The big challenge for me with contract monitoring is at the moment we're collecting numbers. We need to move towards outcomes, and we need to move towards how this is really contributing to change. So we know that the supply chain in the last year created 1,160 jobs. What was the quality of the jobs? How many of those jobs were zero-hour contracts? How many of those jobs lasted for a week? How many of those jobs lasted for a month? So we need to be a lot more kind of considerate of outcomes in terms of how we measure. So there's just some other examples of data there. We then started to think about 5 years ago, well, places aren't just about local authorities spending money. There's a range of other institutions that have a stake within place. And we borrowed heavily from the United States and the whole concept of anchor institutions. And I think these institutions are important for places for 4 reasons. One is that they spend lots of money, so through procurement. 2, they employ lots of people. 3, they own a lot of land and assets, so a lot of the property within our localities will be owned by these types of institutions. And 4th, they're not going to go anywhere. Hopefully a hospital isn't going to leave a particular area of London and transfer itself to Glasgow. So those organisations all have kind of a potential which needs to be harnessed more effectively, and that's why we started kind of working in Preston. This kind of work has evolved. So in Birmingham at the moment we're looking at kind of employment and the role of employment within anchor institutions, and we're also looking at the role of assets. So looking at the role of a hospital, not only in terms of kind of contributing towards health outcomes, but also how hospitals contribute to wider economic and social outcomes. So we started in Preston, but the focus in Preston was procurement. And again, I'm sure everyone's seen this data before, but again, I would reiterate that this isn't just about local spend. This is about cultural shift. This is about kind of changing the mindset of a group of institutions that have a stake in place. So this takes you back 5 years. We work with 7 different anchor institutions: the University of Central Lancashire, 2 local authorities, a top tier and a district, 2 colleges, the police, and Community Gateway, which is a housing organisation. We looked collectively at their procurement spend, and this was the figure. So 5% of spend across those organisations was in the red area, which is the Preston City Council boundary. 39% in wider Lancashire, and 61% leaking out of the Lancashire economy. And that's what we've kind of focused upon over the course of the last 5 years. We've started to think about the extent to which that spend is potentially influenceable. And by influenceable, we mean spend that's not tied up in national frameworks. We mean spend that's not necessarily available within that particular local area or within the wider Northwest, but spend where there's scope for an organisation based in Preston or Lancashire to potentially deliver that good or service moving forward. And potentially is a really important word in all of this. That supplier still has to compete. That supplier still has to prove that they are the best value tenderer for that particular contract in cost, in quality, and also in social value terms. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to kind of touch upon a couple. What's really important in the anchor institution work is leadership. So there's been really strong, defined political and senior officer leadership across those anchor institutions to stimulate a change in the way in which their organisations operate and the way in which their officers and other individuals within that organisation operates as well. In terms of development, what we've focused on more recently is the scope for cooperative models to be developed in Preston that deliver gaps in procurement opportunities. So one of the key gaps that we've identified is that around about £10 million of catering spend leaks out of the Lancashire economy to a large multinational corporation. Preston is surrounded by farmland, where you can pretty much produce everything that you require for that economy to be sustainable. So what we've done is we've developed a food cooperative that will develop its knowledge, its capacity, its skills moving forward, with the hope in the future that it does become the best value contractor to deliver some of those services in the future. Another key point with all this is going to take time. This is not, with both these examples, this hasn't happened overnight. This is a kind of a long-term shift in behaviour. In terms of the change, in terms of some of the incremental change, what we've calculated is that as a result of that work and other activities, so Preston's done a lot of work trying to think through its pension funds and how that can be reinvested in regeneration initiatives. It's done a lot of work thinking about the whole cooperative development model, and a lot of work around kind of community land trusts and other forms of initiative. And that has led to a shift in that procurement spend. So there's now an increased spend of £70 million through each of those 7 anchor institutions being delivered by organisations based within Preston, and an increase of around £200 million in wider Lancashire. Just a couple more slides and then I'm done, I promise. So why the change? I think there's kind of 6 reasons why there's been change in these 2 organisations, and this applies to numerous local authorities and other organisations that we've worked with. You need to have organisational policy drivers. I think that procurement has to be linked to your economic strategy. It has to be linked to your corporate strategy. So if you're going to change the whole culture of procurement, you've got to make sure it delivers outcomes that are relevant to your place and to your wider strategic thinking. The other thing that I've really seen is a change in the behaviour of procurement officers. Procurement officers have really started to become more personable, I think is the word. Less working in silos, more joined up within local government, and actually really thinking, using their own individual values to shape what they do on a day-to-day basis within their organisations and their institutions. And it's amazing some of the behaviour change that we've seen across procurement officers. The 4th thing, I think, is this link between procurement and economic development. If we're going to change the way in which we do procurement, we've got to understand the market better. Otherwise, we're still going to have the same old suppliers coming and tendering for contract opportunities. Economic development teams, if they still exist in your local authorities or your organisations, are really important in understanding who that potential market is and where those gaps can potentially be delivered. And finally, I think the changes come as a result of a shift in process. EU regulations around procurement have changed in 2014. That's enabled a greater emphasis upon social and environmental goals. It's enabled greater flexibility in the procurement process, and it's enabled authorities to consider SMEs in particular in delivery. So there's been change at European level, change at national level, change at local level. So finally, where next? We need to involve citizens in all of this. We need to engage with citizens as to what they need in procurement projects. I've just been working on a European project in 11 cities, including Candelaria on the island of Tenerife. Yeah, I get to go to Candelaria every 3 months. But what's really striking about Candelaria is that citizens are engaged in every single procurement decision that's made. They shape what's purchased. They shape the process that's undertaken. I still think there needs to be more effective commissioner to procurer relations. If you haven't thought about social value in the procurement stage, it's way too late. Your commissioners need to be thinking about social value and embedding that. We need to think about public procurement of innovation. I'm not sure of any UK authorities which are really innovating in the way in which they're procuring. So going to the market and saying, look, these are our outcomes. You produce us something, rather than here's a tender document, you fill that in. Here's your service, this is what we want. There needs to be more innovation in how we procure. Contract management I've talked about, anchor institutions I've talked about, influenceable spend I've talked about. Capacity, this is really important. Austerity has led to kind of dwindling capacity in local authority procurement departments, and also, and probably most importantly, in terms of contract management. If we're serious about delivering social value, we also need to contract monitor. So if a supplier is saying, oh, we're going to create 5 apprenticeships, we need to know the quality. We need to know what contribution that is making towards wider outcomes. We need to know what savings that is making to the state. And I'll leave that. And that's me. Thanks very much.